And welcome to another edition of the Traction Reaction Podcast. I'm Steve Zotke. Joining us once again is Denny Miller, all the way from Los Angeles in Indianapolis. We're here in Brownsburg, actually, the home of Turn 4 Restorations and Vintage Indy. And we're talking vintage, old-time Indy cars, aren't we, Denny?
We are. And that time of year again.
It certainly is. Last year we had a lot of fun talking about Eddie Sachs. This year we're going to talk about, well, remembering some drivers we lost in the late 50s. Of course, 1958 and 59 was kind of rough for IndyCar racing. And in 1958, a very, very popular driver from North Vernon, Indiana, Pat O'Connor, lost his life in a controversial accident caused by a pileup in Turn 3.
It was. And Pat O'Connor had appeared on Sports Illustrated 2 days before that. They were calling him the cover boy. They already had thought it was developing a reputation as the loose jinx. Bob Schweikert had appeared on it in May of '56, and then he gets killed at Salem in June of '56. And of course, Eddie Sachs was thinking that he should have been on there instead of Pat O'Connor, and they were kidding each other on that. But it was a year that we had Dick Rathman on the pole with a 4-lap track record. You had Ed Elysian starting in the middle of the front row with a 1-lap track record. And the consensus was there's going to be a wreck. And they didn't know where it was going to be. Some people thought it was going to be on the first turn. Bob Weiss says, no, it won't be on the first turn, it'll be on the third turn, because they weren't running fast enough. And it got screwed up at the very beginning. This was the second year when they tried to start the race from the pits. And the previous year, 1957, you had an accident with Elmer George wrecking on the pace lap. So they tried again in 58, and Rathman took off. Elysian immediately followed, and the third person in the front row was Jimmy Reese, and he took off. And then Sam Hanks, who had won the 1957 Indy 500, retired, was now driving the pace car. He picked up the second row, and there was confusion all along. They're trying to speed him up, slow him down. So eventually, Rathman, Elysian, and Reese circle the entire track and then come through, and they're really just kind of passing cars almost as they're leading to the start-finish line. Now, it has been rumored and fairly strongly acknowledged that Rathman and Elysian had a bet for at least $10,000 who would win the first lap. And Ed Elysian had a lot of pressure on him. He had gambling issues, and West Coast people were out to get his money. He also was a bit of embarrassment to USAC in that he was passing bad checks locally. Financial pressures, I think, in part contributed to Ed's need to win that bet to alleviate some of that. So,
well, he was hired by A.J. Watson, and a lot of people were like, A.J., why are you hiring this guy? He's kind of a scoundrel. He's got a bit of a reputation, and AJ thought he was one of the best drivers he had ever hired from just a pure talent point of view. But as we know in racing today, and the same back then, it's the total package, and you have to have not only a good team behind you, but the driver has to be at his best. And perhaps Ed wasn't really at his best. He had other outside issues.
He came from a fairly wealthy family. His family was in the rug merchant business. The guy accused him of saying he might be the black sheep of the family or something like that. He certainly liked racing better than the rug business. But also Ed Elysian was very popular in 1955 in that he spun his car when Bill Vukovich had his fatal wreck and ran toward Vukovich's car to try to save him from the fire. and they had to restrain him. Some people say they had to knock him out. Some I don't think that's true,
No.
but at that point, Ed Legion was regarded as quite a hero, and then the gambling issue got to him, and so as they were going through turn 1 and 2, Rathbun was leading, and going down the backstretch, it was still Rathbun. As they were going into turn 3, Elysian went in way too hard, and then slides into Rathbun, and both of them go into the wall, and it created a 16-car pileup.
Well, and some of the blame went to Jimmy Reese.
Yes.
Jimmy Reese hit the brakes really hard when some drivers and later would say, you know, if Jimmy just would have kept on going, those two idiots would have went up against the wall, quote unquote, would have went against the wall, and the field probably could have gone past. But Reese hit the brakes hard. Veith hit him, and then Connor
went over Jimmy Reese's wheel, and the appearance of the accident didn't look that bad, but it landed upside down and flipped back over, and Pat was laying kind of in the center of the track, and perhaps 30 seconds or so passed before a trickle of flame ignited, and it started burning. But it wasn't a fire type of like Sachs McDonald's.
Right, it was more of an alcohol fire. But you know, when you see it in the videos and that, I mean, they say, you know, the following year they passed legislation that row bars were mandatory. But even in that situation, I don't think a row bar would have saved Pat O'Connor. But it was just just an unlucky how that car came down, you know, just at the worst possible way, and fortunately killed Pat O'Connor. And
the new race cars today that they have at Indy, O'Connor would have been okay.
Oh yeah. But just having a single row bar, I don't think that would have made a difference. But you know, Pat O'Connor was the All-American boy. The fans loved him. You know, home state boy, very popular. He was involved in the community. He had a restaurant. He had businesses in North Vernon, and was actually kind of setting himself up for what he's going to do after racing, you know, as a businessman and whatnot. And there's a lot of people. There's even speculation that Pat O'Connor could have been, you know, in charge of the Speedway.
Well, it was. I have that. Tony Holman offered him to be president of the Speedway. It had been Wilbur Shaw's job, and Wilbur got killed in October of '54 in a plane crash, and no one had replaced him. Pat was kind of a protege of Wilbur, and Tony liked him. Very good-looking guy, very humble type person. And Tony said, and Pat said, well, I'd at least like to win Indy one time. And Tony said, you don't even have to win Indy. The job's yours. So,
and he's driving for Sumar, which is pretty much a local team out of Terre Haute. So, I mean, it had all the placards of a popular win if he would have won. And there's a good chance in '58 he could have. He had a very, very strong car, and everything was kind of coming together. But unfortunately, that crash. And Ed Elysian certainly took a lot of the blame for that crash, didn't he?
Absolutely. And immediately, Dwayne Carter, who at that time was director of competition for the United States Auto Club, goes down to John Zink's pit and says, if you're thinking about using Elysian, don't. He's suspended. And Elysian basically said, you can't suspend me. And he said, well, you're suspended. And so that he appealed it, and the USAC allowed him to race again. And then a few days later, he was involved in a fatal crash at New Bremen with a driver named Davis, and it was just a kind of racing accident. But but what got Ed was driving with a suspended license, and that was the thing. They suspended him. But a lot of people liked Ed. I know Clint Bronner tried to help. Tom Benford tried to help, and I think Mary Holman George was involved in it, where they actually anonymously put together money to pay off Elysian's gambling expenses, and he was to repay those expenses with his race winnings. But they got thinking, well, you know, this is a dangerous business. He might get killed, so they took out a life insurance policy on Ed Elysian. And as it turned out, he would lose his life in Milwaukee. He was reinstated, and then promptly lost his life.
Very shortly, you know, within about a month. He ran a sprint car race at before Milwaukee, and then he was killed. He was running a Travelon trailer car that Jack Turner had raced at the Speedway in, and A.J. Foyt had blew an engine. There was a yellow, and or there wasn't a yellow, but there was a warning flag, and Elysian spun. Now people say he hit the wall and he just kind of went up it real easy and over. I'll post a photo of the front of the car, but it was a solid hit to the front. And then the car pivoted up and flipped over.
But apparently it reached that tipping point, and would it tip over or not? And it just reached it and it went upside down. That didn't have a roll bar on it, did it?
It didn't have a roll bar, but unfortunately it went forward. The roll bar was bent forward. And because of the way the car had landed, you know, roadsters in those days had a cutout on one side. And not to get too grisly here, but he was able to unbuckle his belt and be prone in the car when they found him. But he was unable to get out of the car, and it was just not a good situation.
And then there was all these rumors that they were purposely taking their time to get to, that they disliked.
That is not true.
That's not true, but it's, if you say it enough times, it kind of becomes true.
The problem was, you know, the roadsters in those days, you know, carried up to 75 gallons of methanol, and it was just very hard to get the fire out. In fact, they got powder on it right away, but then they had to bring the fire truck in with water. They doused it with water, and it was just a bad situation, and he died of burn. The car was, you know, was repaired basically, and that is the car that Jim Hurtubise broke the record the following year at Indianapolis in 1960. So, as was the case in those days, you know, if a car was involved in a fatal crash, it wasn't necessarily the end of that car. They would just repair it and off it went. In fact, one car, the car that got to do a cut here. Okay, I'm going to do this. The car that Eddie Nicholson was killed in at Milwaukee in 1946 was the same car Gus Schrader was killed in at Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1942. And then later, a driver was killed in that same car in Indiana a few years later. So that driver was involved in 3 fatalities.
Well, you had, trying to think, Van Johnson was driving the car that someone was killed in.
Was that the Dick Linder car?
No, Dick Linder got killed in it after Van Johnson got killed in it. But they asked Van Johnson. He said, "No, the car's fine. Just an unfortunate accident." Now, I should know who that is.
Yeah,
I don't. So we won't go on that way.
But it was a rough time, and you know, when a driver gets hurt, you know, it's a bad thing. But back in the day, it wasn't unusual to open up your old Speed Sport News or a newspaper and see your favorite driver was killed, you know, in an Indy car race, stock car race, or a sprint car race somewhere. And then 1959, of course, Jerry Unser unfortunately lost his life at the Speedway in a kind of a silly accident. He wasn't really even that far up to speed, and got burned and received painful burns, which unfortunately, with the medical technology the way it is now, you would have easily, you know, survived it, especially with the uniforms they had.
Yeah, he died of urine poisoning.
Yeah.
The car actually flipped several times and then caught fire. But, they thought he was going to survive.
Yeah.
And after
I remember
almost a couple of weeks, then he dies of it.
I I remember talking to his brother Bobby Unser, and he, to this, back even years later, it still bothered him that he seemed to, as Bobby said, kind of died senselessly.
But that, because of that, they then started making the drivers do that, take their uniforms and dip it in that borax type solution, which they hated because it was itchy and irritated the skin and everything. And
only gave you a few seconds of protection. It wasn't until later where the protection really increased. And nowadays, the problem is it will protect you against the flames and that, but you still get a heat transfer.
Mm-hmm.
So, but technology has certainly advanced, hasn't it, Denny?
Oh, it's definitely safer as it's ever been. In fact, Bill Simpson years ago, to show his uniforms, he would light himself on fire and not get hurt by that.
And Denny, you have a book coming out.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, it's unique in that I took the best of the best from my book, Eddie Sachs, The Clown Prince of Racing, and made it into a screenplay format. It sets up the scenes and it reads like a dialogue of that. And the book or the screenplay is called Saxational, and it follows Eddie Sachs's career, and it has some, it's very realistic. It opens up with Gordon Reed and getting decapitated at Dayton in 1952. Part of the reason I did that was that Sachs soon marries Betty Reed, the widow, who had 4 little bitty daughters, 4 years old, 3 years old, 1.5, and 6 weeks old. But she also had Gordon Reed's race car, and Sachs now had a race car that he could run, but he quickly got tired of 4 little fussy, screaming kids driving around in a station wagon with no air conditioning and things, and then soon after, Mary Holman offers him a ride in the House sprint car. Now, Mary Holman was Tony Holman's daughter and owned one of the best sprint cars. So now, Eddie didn't need that midget, so he sold that midget to, I think, one of Charlie Sachs's friends out east, and kept the money himself and drove the House sprint car. But Eddie was always looking out for himself, but in a very jovial way. He was never mean-spirited about it. So then we tell some of the early Sachs stories that are not necessarily PC correct by any means. There's a teaser to go buy it or something like that, but it'll play very well on the screen. Sachs was very critical about Jimmy Bryan coming out of retirement to run Langhorne in 1960. We have a scene there where Jimmy Bryan driving Roger Ward's car, because Ward absolutely hated Langhorne, and he goes down into Pute Hollow, which is the equivalent of turn 2, on the opening lap on the outside of the front row, and just as a series of 5 very vicious flips, and each time it comes down on top of him on the cockpit. It's certainly a graphic accident, but it happened. It's not made up stuff like Fast and Furious. Then in 1961, when it looked like the 150-mile-an-hour barrier was finally going to be broken at Indy, it was the day before pole day. Tony Bettenhausen had the Autolite special at 149.6. They buttoned it up for the rest of the day. And Paul Russo, a friend of Tony's, was struggling to get what was Roger Ward's winning car from 1959 up to speed, and asked Tony, could he shake it down? Lindsey Hopkins, the car owner, was adamant, no, you're not. Jack Beckley, the chief mechanic, was equally said, no, you're under contract, you can't do it. But Bettenhausen was pretty headstrong and did it anyway.
He was his good friend.
And then he loses a bolt coming down the main straightaway off the radius rod, and he goes to touch the brake. It veers toward the outside wall and gets on top of the wall and starts knocking down I think 8 or 9 fence posts, and it cocoons itself in all that wire fencing and lands upside down on fire. So that scene's in it as well. It really bothered Eddie Sachs. At first, Sachs thought it was Russo that had been killed, and then realized it was Tony Bettenhausen, who just sobbed like a baby for it. But then goes out the next day, and Sachs wins the poll for the second year in a row. So
Johnny Parsons, who you might have seen in the background here just before, Johnny Parsons Jr. was a 16-year-old stooging, and he saw the accident, he saw the whole thing. He told me he sat down on the pit wall and just cried because he knew he had lost Tony Bettenhausen. You could tell it was Tony by his helmet. He was wearing an old Cromwell helmet. But a similar thing happened in 1968 with the turbines. The number 30 turbine was being practiced by Greg Weld, USAC sprint car driver, who was still a rookie at that point, and was having handling issues. Mike Spence, who was on loan from BRM, was driving, Formula One driver. The turbines were supposed to have Jackie Stewart and Jim Clark drive it.
Mm-hmm.
Jackie Stewart was out with a wrist injury, had broken his wrist, and of course Clark was killed in Hockenheim the previous month. So Mike Spence was doing Lotus a favor on loan from BRM. Andy Granatelli asked him to shake down the 30 car. He goes out, and he has a suspension failure, hits the wall, and gets hit by the tire, comes back, killing him. Greg Weld's wife sees the accident, thought it was Greg. They had similar white helmets. So she had a very not a good day that day. It was until half hour later or so that she found out that it was not Greg.
And that opened the door for Joe Leonard getting the turbine ride and then sitting on the pole. Parnelli could have had it. He had ran the other turbine in '67 and dominated. Didn't want to get into that wedge-shaped Lotus. So, but there again, with the tethering system today, that really couldn't happen.
It was a rough sport back then, but we certainly applaud the safety measures that have come. And once again, Denny, we appreciate it. And if somebody's interested in your book, or how do they contact you?
Well, it's Amazon's as good a source. They can find Eddie Sachs, the Clown Prince of Racing. They can find the Eddie Rickenbacker era, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, 1928 to 1945, or the new one, Saxational, the screenplay, and that will read like a screenplay.
If you're interested in helping Denny out with that, he is looking for funding or people that are interested in backing this. So we'll have the contact information.
Well, Steve, you're really an authority on a lot of the historical race movies. Tell me about, did you see Ford versus Ferrari?
Well, yes, I did.
You know, it had an $85 million budget, it's made $225.5 million, and got nominated for Best Picture for an Oscar.
It certainly did.
But how do you think that's going to compare to the new one coming out called Saxational about Eddie Sachs?
Well, is it going to have AJ Foyt in it?
It'll have Foyt in it, winning when Sachs pits with 3 laps to go.
Is it going to have the Smokey Eunuch in the sidecar?
Sidecar's in it and scares the you-know-what out of Dwayne Carter when he took it out.
Husky Andy Granatelli in his STP suit?
In his STP suit.
Well, it sounds like Saxational's going to be the winner.
Well, I hope so. Would you walk the red carpet with us?
Only if we can hold hands.
Well, if not, you can pull the wagon with the beer in it. Miller beer.
Very good.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
So thank you once again for watching the Traction Reaction Podcast. I'm Steve Zotke along with Denny Miller. We appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel below, and feel free to share this video too on social media. Thank you once again, and we'll have more coverage from Indianapolis in 2023. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.